In 1998, a retired pathologist named Eugene Foster sent blood samples from a handful of elderly men to a genetics lab in England. None of those men were famous. What connected them was a Y chromosome, passed from father to son, largely unchanged for 200 years, and a question that had been sitting unresolved in American history since the year 1802. Did Thomas Jefferson father children with a woman he owned? The answer that came back changed the official story of one of the most famous men in American history. But it didn't answer the question the way most people think it did. This video is about a family that carried an account of its own origins for 6 generations, while much of Jefferson's scholarship dismissed it. And it's about what happened when a genetics lab finally tested a piece of that account, a century and a quarter after the family first told it publicly. Thomas Jefferson wrote the words, "All men are created equal," in 1776. Over the course of his life, he enslaved more than 600 people. He freed almost none of them while he was alive. Every person he formally freed in his lifetime and in his will belonged to one family, the Hemings family. The people Jefferson chose to free matter to what comes next. Sally Hemings was born in 1773 at a plantation called the Forest in Charles City County, Virginia. Her mother was an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Hemings, known as Betty. Her father was a white planter and slave trader named John Wales. That made Sally the half-sister of John Wales's white daughter, Martha, who would go on to marry Thomas Jefferson. John Wales died in 1773. The Hemings family became part of the Jefferson household through that inheritance, arriving at Monticello in 1774. Sally was about a year old. She had no say in where she was taken. Martha Jefferson died in 1782. After years of difficult childbirths, Jefferson was 39. He reportedly promised her, at her deathbed, that he would never remarry. He kept that promise for the next 44 years. He also, for the rest of his life, lived alongside the woman who was his late wife's half-sister, a woman he owned. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson arranged for someone to accompany his younger daughter across the Atlantic to Paris, where he was serving as the American minister to France. Her older brother James was already there, training as a French chef in Jefferson's household. Sally Hemings made that crossing while still a teenager. France, at that moment, offered something Virginia didn't. Under French law, an enslaved person brought into the country could petition the courts for freedom, and such petitions were generally successful. Madison Hemings would later describe his mother's position more simply. In France, she was free. She didn't have to get on a ship back. She came back anyway. We only know why because of one document. In 1873, Sally Hemings' son Madison gave an interview to a newspaper editor in Ohio. According to Madison, his mother initially refused to return to Virginia, and Jefferson negotiated with her, extraordinary privileges for her, and a pledge that any children she had would be freed at 21. She returned to Virginia around 1789, still a teenager, and Madison's account says she gave birth to her first child by Jefferson not long afterward, a child who died young. No surviving Jefferson record confirms that birth. That's the only source for any of this. There's no letter from Jefferson confirming it. It rests on the word of a son, describing what his mother told him decades later about a negotiation between a teenager and the man who owned her. Jefferson's surviving records document 6 children born to Sally Hemings between 1795 and 1808. 2 died in infancy. 4 survived: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. For the rest of her life, Sally Hemings worked at Monticello as a lady's maid and seamstress. She left no letters, no diary. There are only a handful of surviving descriptions of her appearance or demeanor, and not one word in her own hand about any of it. Whatever she thought, she took it with her. But the story she told her children didn't disappear. It went into a family and stayed there. In 1802, a journalist named James Callender published an article in a Richmond newspaper naming Sally as the enslaved woman he claimed Jefferson kept as a concubine. Callender was a former Jefferson ally who felt Jefferson had failed to reward him with a political appointment, and the accusation served his grievance. But the rumor wasn't something he invented from nothing. It had already been circulating in Virginia. Jefferson never publicly answered the accusation. It was mocked in Federalist newspapers, turned into cartoons, and eventually set aside by an alternative explanation that Jefferson's white grandchildren offered decades later. They said the father of Sally Hemings' children wasn't Jefferson at all, but one of two nephews, Samuel or Peter Carr, sons of Jefferson's sister. The Carr explanation became the dominant account in most Jefferson scholarship through much of the 20th century. The Hemings family had a different account the entire time. In 1873, Madison Hemings told the newspaper editor plainly that he and his siblings Beverly, Harriet, and Eston were the children of Thomas Jefferson. For the next 125 years, that interview sat in an archive, treated by most historians as a claim not worth taking seriously. Inside the Hemings family, the account didn't waver. Monticello's own oral history project later found that descendants of Madison Hemings had passed the story down across as many as 8 generations, often in what the researchers described as a climate of disbelief and hostility. Descendants of Eston Hemings, whose branch of the family moved north and began passing as white, went further. By the 1940s, they were quietly telling people they descended from an uncle of Thomas Jefferson's rather than Thomas Jefferson himself. It was a safer story to tell. The physical evidence that would eventually test part of this account took the form of a Y-chromosome. The Y-chromosome is typically passed from father to son, and it changes only slowly across generations. Trace an unbroken line of fathers and sons far enough back, and the men at both ends will carry a nearly identical Y-chromosome, even 200 years apart. Thomas Jefferson had no surviving legitimate sons, so there was no direct Jefferson male line left to test in the 1990s. But Jefferson had a paternal uncle, Field Jefferson, and Field Jefferson had male line descendants still living. If those descendants carried a distinctive Y-chromosome haplotype, Thomas Jefferson would have carried the same one because they shared a common male line ancestor. In 1998, Eugene Foster and a team of geneticists in England tested 19 Y-chromosome markers across several groups: 5 male line descendants of Field Jefferson, a male line descendant of Eston Hemings, male line descendants of Thomas Woodson, a man some historians believed was Sally Hemings' first child, and 3 male line descendants of 3 sons of John Carr, the paternal grandfather of Samuel and Peter Carr, standing in as a proxy for the Carr line. The results, published in the journal Nature in November of 1998, 4 of the 5 Field Jefferson descendants carried the same rare Y-chromosome haplotype. Eston Hemings' male line descendant matched it. The Carr descendants did not. Neither did the Woodson descendants. In plain terms, a Jefferson man fathered Eston Hemings. The Carr brothers, blamed for 150 years, were ruled out. But the result had an important limitation. It does not say Thomas Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings. It says a man who shared Thomas Jefferson's Y-chromosome did. Thomas Jefferson was not the only man alive who carried it. His younger brother, Randolph Jefferson, carried it too. So did Randolph's 5 sons, and roughly 24 adult Jefferson men living in Virginia at the time. Eugene Foster knew this. Within days of publication, he wrote a clarifying letter stating that his findings did not, on their own, prove Thomas Jefferson was the father, and that he found it regrettable the study had been read in public, as closing the question entirely. The headline that ran in Nature, "Jefferson fathered slave's last child," came from the journal's editors, not the scientists. So the Y-DNA closes off one explanation and narrows the field. It doesn't by itself name Thomas Jefferson. What narrows the field further is paperwork. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which runs Monticello, appointed a research committee in December of 1998, weeks after the Nature study appeared, to reassess the historical evidence. As part of that work, Monticello's director of archaeology, Fraser Neiman, went through Jefferson's own farm books and memorandum books, which recorded in detail when he traveled and when he was home, and compared that record against the estimated conception window for each of the 6 children in Jefferson's records. Jefferson was documented as present at Monticello during the conception window for every one of those 6 children. None of the conceptions occurred during his extended absences. Several fell within about 3 weeks of his return from a trip. Neiman modeled the odds of that pattern occurring by pure coincidence at roughly 1 in 100. That figure describes the unlikelihood of the observed correlation between Jefferson's presence and Sally Hemings' conceptions under a chance model. It's a different calculation from the DNA's haplotype rarity, and it isn't a 99% probability that Jefferson was the father. It's evidence that strengthens the case for Thomas Jefferson specifically, on top of what the DNA had already narrowed. The Foundation's committee published its findings in January of 2000. The evidence indicated a high probability that Jefferson was the father of Eston Hemings, and likely of all 6 children recorded in Jefferson's papers. In 2018, alongside a new exhibit devoted to Sally Hemings' life, the Foundation called the matter settled. Not every historian agreed, and the disagreement is worth representing on its own terms. In 2000, a group called the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society formed specifically to challenge that conclusion. The following year, they published a report from a panel of 13 historians and researchers they called the Scholars Commission. 12 of the 13 signed the majority report, concluding that Jefferson's paternity had not been proven. Their argument centered on the same point the DNA itself makes. The haplotype identifies a Jefferson, not specifically Thomas. They argued that Randolph Jefferson or members of his family offered plausible alternative candidates, and they challenged aspects of Neiman's statistical method. One member of the panel, Paul Rahe, filed a separate opinion. He agreed with most of his colleagues' reasoning but broke with their conclusion, writing that he considered it somewhat more likely than not that Thomas Jefferson specifically had fathered Eston. The mainstream historical position today, and the position of the institution that runs Monticello, is that Thomas Jefferson fathered Sally Hemings' children. That conclusion rests on the DNA, excluding the Carr explanation, the travel records placing Jefferson at Monticello for every conception, the unusual pattern of freedom he granted within the Hemings family, and the oral history the Hemings family had maintained for over a century before any of it was tested. A minority of historians and genealogists continues to argue the case is not fully closed, and that Randolph Jefferson deserves more serious consideration. What happened to the 6 children in Jefferson's records? 2 died in infancy. Of the 4 who survived, Beverly and Harriet were allowed to leave Monticello quietly without being pursued in the early 1820s. Beverly was about 24 when he left, Harriet about 21. Madison and Eston were formally freed through Jefferson's will after his death in 1826. Madison was 21 at the time. Eston was 18. Sally Hemings herself was never formally freed by Jefferson. After his death, his daughter Martha gave her what was called at the time her time, an informal, unofficial freedom that let her live out her remaining years in Charlottesville with her sons Madison and Eston. She died in 1835. Madison Hemings became a woodworker and farmer, married, and settled in southern Ohio, where he lived within the black community for the rest of his life, never hiding who his father was. A census taker who visited his home in 1870 wrote beside his name in the record book, "This man is the son of Thomas Jefferson." Eston Hemings became a professional musician and carpenter. He married and eventually moved his family north, first to Ohio, then to Wisconsin, where his branch changed its surname to Jefferson and over time was assumed by neighbors to be white. That had an institutional home on the other side of the family. A private lineage organization called the Monticello Association, made up of descendants of Jefferson's white daughter, controls burial rights in the Jefferson family cemetery to this day. In 1999, a Jefferson descendant named Lucian Truscott invited Hemings family descendants to the association's annual reunion for the first time. Around 35 came. In 2002, the association's members voted on whether to recognize Hemings descendants with full membership rights, including burial in the family cemetery. 67 voted against, 5 voted in favor. Hemings descendants went on to organize their own reunion at Monticello, and later, gatherings brought together descendants from multiple Monticello families. Monticello, the institution, has moved further. For decades, the room believed to have been Sally Hemings' quarters in the South Wing had been put to another use. In 1941, it was converted into a men's restroom. Restoration work carried out as part of a larger project removed the 20th century bathroom and restored the space. And in 2018, it opened to the public as part of a new exhibit, The Life of Sally Hemings. The exhibit's language is worth repeating closely. Enslaved women had no legal right to consent. Their masters owned their labor, their bodies, and their children. That legal reality makes a conventional love story framing misleading. Jefferson was 3 decades older than Sally Hemings, and she had been enslaved by his household since she was a small child. Under Virginia law, an enslaved woman had no legal capacity to refuse a master, and her children automatically inherited her enslaved status regardless of who fathered them. The historian Annette Gordon Reed, who has written the most extensively on this relationship, has argued plainly that Sally Hemings could not refuse Jefferson's advances. She has also cautioned against flattening the account into a single, uniform reading, since we have no record at all of what Sally Hemings herself felt. What the record shows is the enormous legal power Jefferson held over her life. Her 4 surviving children eventually became free. Beverly and Harriet were allowed to leave Monticello without pursuit, while Madison and Eston were freed through Jefferson's will. Go back to 1998 to Eugene Foster mailing blood samples across the Atlantic. The Y-DNA proved that a man carrying Thomas Jefferson's Y-chromosome fathered Eston Hemings, and it ruled out the Carr brothers, who had been blamed for a century and a half. It didn't on its own name Thomas Jefferson rather than his brother or nephews. What makes the case for Thomas Jefferson specifically is everything else laid alongside it: the travel records, the pattern of manumission, and an account one family had already been telling for 125 years before a lab in England ever got involved. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.